Hello, and welcome to my session of the Skill Exchange, Demystifying Common Metrics. My name is Mandy George, and I currently work as a Senior E-commerce Analyst at Staples Canada. I'm a 3-time member of the Adobe Analytics Champions program. I'm also a user group leader for the Analytics Champions office hours and a community advisor on the Experience League forums. You can feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to chat about analytics. So in this session, I'm going to cover some of the common metrics that you see every day and explain a little bit more about what they mean. The session should help you understand how these metrics are defined and what they're really telling you. You should also know when and how to use these metrics, or when not to use them and what you should use instead. And all of this should help you understand how to pick the best metric for each situation and maximize the usefulness of your reporting. So when you look at your components list, you probably see most of these metrics every day, but we're going to look at them in more detail. We'll start off with unique visitors, visits, page events, and page views. We'll cover what the difference is between them. Then we'll go over occurrences, which you've probably seen as Adobe's default metric in freeform tables. We'll look at bounces, bounce rate, and single page visits and what the subtle differences are between them. We'll look at conversion rate, orders over visit, and orders per visits. Then we'll look at all of our time spent on site metrics. And finally, we'll go over bot occurrences, bot page views, and bot page view ratio. These ones you might not have used quite as often as the others, but they can still provide you some pretty good information. So let's get started with our visits and visitors. These metrics you've probably used every day, but there are some distinctions that are very important. First, unique visitors is the number of distinct visitor IDs that have visited your site. A visit, on the other hand, is a single continuous browsing session until there's 30 minutes of inactivity. This is the standard definition of when a visit ends, but this can be altered using a VRS or a virtual report suite. When estimating the amount of traffic coming to your site, you're probably going to use one of these two metrics. Some of the other common metrics that you'll see are page views, which is the number of times that a dimension was set or persisted on a page. And finally, page events, which is the number of times that any link tracking call was made. Page views and page events are mutually exclusive. A hit can be one or the other. Looking at these together, you can think of unique visitors as a book series. The series as a whole is a single item, but within that series, there's a number of individual books. Each of those books is like a visit. A single visitor can have multiple visits. Then within each visit or book, there are a number of pages. Each page is either a page view or a page event. Let's look at all of these in a little bit more detail. First, we have visitors. So we know that this is the distinct count of customer IDs on your site. But there's a lot of factors that can impact this. If a customer visits your site using 2 or more different browsers or devices, each browser and device is going to have a different visitor ID. Also, if they use a private browsing session like Google's incognito window, that again makes them look like a new customer. All of this means that over a long period of time, the same person might appear as 2 or more different visitors on your site. Now, there are some things that won't impact the visitor count. If someone closes or updates their browser, that doesn't impact their visitor ID. Restarting your computer or changing your network also doesn't have an impact. Next is visits. We know that a browsing session continues until there's 30 minutes of inactivity, but there are a lot of other things as well that can cause a visit to end. If there's 12 hours of continuous activity, at that 12-hour mark, the visit ends and any subsequent activity starts a new visit. Another way for a visit to end is if there's 2,500 hits. Once you hit 2,501, you've got a new visit. The next way is if there's 100 hits in 100 seconds, although traffic this rapid is typically bot traffic. And finally, some of the other ways that a visit can end is if somebody clears their cache, resets their cookies, or switches browsers or devices. These actions also cause someone to look like a new visitor, so with the new visitor comes a new visit as well. But there are also several actions that don't end a visit, such as going past midnight. Your visit can span from one day to the next, but that midnight time point doesn't end a visit like it does on some other analytics platforms. This is important to keep in mind when you're looking at your data, as one day can be as one visit, can be associated with two different dates. Adobe does also support multi-tab browsing, so opening a new tab, as long as it's in the same browser, won't start a new visit. Your visitor can switch back and forth between the tabs, and those hits will be stitched together to make one visit. Other actions like closing and reopening your browser, restarting your computer, or switching networks also won't cause your visit to end, as long as the time that you're away from the site is less than 30 minutes. When you return, it'll continue the same visit. So whether you use visits or visitors to count your traffic, as long as you understand the caveats to both, it's up to you to decide what you want to do. I've worked at companies that use visits and others that prefer to use visitors. My personal preference is to use visits to measure my traffic because over a long period of time, visitors can tend to double count people. Finally, we have page views and page events. If you've used the tags management platform, you probably recognize the T and TL calls. If you haven't though, that's fine. The T calls are page view calls, so they fire when a customer lands on a page. The TL are custom links, so stuff like customers clicking on a button on your site. The page view metric counts those page view calls and only page view calls. It doesn't include any custom links or other data brought into Workspace via data sources. Page events, on the other hand, are events that are seen on a page. So they include the custom links, download links, and exit links. So these two are mutually exclusive, but a typical visit will be made up of a combination of both of them. Next, let's talk about occurrences. You've definitely seen this one pop up in your dashboard, as occurrences is the default metric that shows up in a freeform table after you drop in a segment or a dimension. Now, you can go into your settings and change this so that way it's a different default metric. Personally, I set my default to be visits, but let's talk about what occurrences actually is. It's the number of hits where a given dimension was set or persisted. This includes most of the hits that you're going to see in your reporting, such as page views, page events like link tracking calls, and data imported via summary data sources. The one thing that this does not include is hits that were excluded due to Adobe's default bot rules. Occurrences can sometimes be confused with instances. All EVARs have an instances metric that goes along with them, but the instances only count with the hit when the dimension was set, whereas occurrences will count the hits where it was set, but also where it persisted. Say, for example, a customer does a search on your site and you fire an EVAR to capture the search term. Both instances and occurrences will fire for that hit, but occurrences will also count any hits where the search term persisted through the rest of the visit. We can also compare occurrences to page views, where page views capture only the page view tracking call. Occurrences capture page views, but also all of the different types of custom links. So occurrences captures a lot of different information. You can think of customers' visits to your site like a fish tank. It contains all the information from what they did. And occurrences are like the fish in that fish tank. They can be quite varied. They can be page views, custom links, searches, product views, cart additions, checkouts, orders, and exit links. Each one of these actions is like a different type of fish, but they're all still fish and they're all still in the same fish tank, so together they make up a pretty good aquarium or a visit to your site. But because occurrences is so varied, there's often a better metric that you can use instead. If you want to look at an EVAR and see how many times it fired, you can use the EVAR instances. The instances only count when a dimension first fires and not any of its persistence. So you can be sure that the number you have is exactly how often customers interacted with something. If you want to know how many pages an item has appeared on, you can look at page views. Alternatively, if you want to know how often something was clicked on, you can use the custom link instances. If you want to know how many unique visitors or visits saw an item at least once, you can use the unique visitors or visits metrics. Instead of counting each interaction, it counts the number of visits or visitors where your dimension was seen, essentially deduplicating the data. Finally, if we want to know how many times something was searched for, instead of occurrences, we can use the metric searches. This is more specific to what we're trying to see. Now, if the search term only fires on searches, then occurrences and searches might end up being the same number. But if you're building a dashboard and sharing it with your business partners and they look at it and see occurrences, they might not know what that means. Whereas if they look at your dashboard and see searches, that might be a little bit easier to understand. So typically you can find something other than occurrences to use that will be a bit more specific and can help people understand the information that you're trying to convey. So now let's talk about bounces and single page visits. A bounce, by definition, is a visit to your site that contains exactly one hit. So someone comes, they load up that first page, they don't interact with it, they don't click on anything, and then they leave. A single page visit is one that contains exactly one unique page identifier. So this means that they can have more than one hit on your website as long as they only see one page. So they come to the site, they load a page, then they get a pop-up asking them to accept cookies, or they get asked to enter their email to be sent a flyer or a coupon, or all of these actions happen. As long as they don't click to a second page, there can be multiple hits and it'll still be a single page visit. Adobe does also create a default relative metric for you called bounce rate. This is calculated as the percent of visits that are a bounce. But since bounces can be impacted by additional calls being fired on that first page, it can actually undercount a little bit. So instead, I've always made a custom bounce rate. This custom bounce rate is the percent of visits that contain a single page visit. If a customer lands on your site, a page view call fires, and then they're asked to accept cookies. Is that a meaningful interaction? Or if there is some other type of pop-up that fired an impression call. Is that meaningful? In most cases, it probably isn't, especially if they didn't do anything else on your site. So creating a custom bounce rate metric using single page visits can help give you a clearer picture of who is bouncing from your site. So just to recap the difference, if someone comes to your website and lands on a page and that's the only call that fires, that's a bounce. But if they also see a bunch of custom link calls in addition to the page view, as long as it's still only one page, that's now a single visit, but it's no longer a bounce. So looking at the performance of these visits, there's Adobe's default bounce rate, which is defined as the percent of visits with exactly one hit. Now notice that it says hit and not page view. It is rare, but it's possible that if a custom link call fires, but no page load calls fires, as long as there's only one hit, that still counts as a bounce. Which is why I prefer to use the custom bounce rate metric where we look at single page visits. This way we don't have to worry about if a call double fires or if there's impressions on the page. Our bounce rate is based on people only seeing that first page. All right, let's talk about conversion rate. There are three different metrics that Adobe provides by default. The first is conversion rate, which is orders divided by visits. The second one is orders over visit, which is also calculated as orders divided by visits. And the third one is orders per visit, which the documentation says is calculated with the formula orders divided by visits. So these three are pretty much the exact same thing. The main difference is how they appear. You can see that conversion rate is a percentage, whereas orders over visits and orders per visits are both decimal numbers, just with different levels of granularity. But with these being relative metrics, there are a few other things that you should keep in mind about how they're calculated. There's another metric that I sometimes use called order success. This isn't an Adobe default metric, this is a calculated one. It's defined as the number of visits that place an order, which does sound the same as conversion rate, but it's slightly different. So let's look at an example. Customer 1 comes to our site and places an order. Customer 2 doesn't buy anything. Customer 3 places an order. Customer 4 places an order, but then realizes they forgot something, so they place a second order in the same visit, and then customer 5 decides not to buy anything. If we were to use the conversion rate metric, we would count the number of orders divided by the number of visits. So 4 orders divided by 5 visits gives us a conversion of 80%. Order success, on the other hand, doesn't count the number of orders, it counts the number of visits with an order. So for customer number 4, instead of counting 2 orders, we count 1 visit. So now our calculation is 3 visits with orders divided by 5 visits gives us an order success rate of 60%. Let's look at a second example. And instead of counting the orders, let's look at another relative metric, add to cart rate. Customer number 1 adds 2 products. Customer 2 doesn't add any. Customer 3 adds 3 products. Customer 4 adds 2. And customer 5 doesn't add any. If we were to calculate add to cart rate the same way that we did order conversion, we would count each cart addition, which is 7, and divide by visits, which is 5, giving us an add to cart rate of 140%, which isn't very useful. Using a metric similar to order success, visits with cart addition, we'll count the number of visits that added a product to cart, which is 3 visits, divided by our total visits, which is 5, to give us a visit with cart addition rate of 60%. This number is a little bit more useful to us. Since you can do more than one cart addition in a visit, looking at the number of visits instead of the raw number of cart additions can help you see how many customers successfully took an action. You can also apply this logic to any event in a visit, especially those that are likely to happen more than once. So now let's look at time spent on site. Adobe has a number of different metrics used to describe how long someone is spending on your website. The first metric is time spent per visit in seconds. This gives you the average amount of time that visitors interact with a given dimension. It's calculated by taking the total amount of seconds and dividing that by the number of visits minus bounces. Why subtract bounces? Well, in order to calculate the length of an interaction, Adobe needs 2 time points, a start and an end. And as we've discussed earlier, a bounce is a single hit. That means that there's a start, but there's no end. Without that, it can't count the amount of time, so those hits get excluded. The second metric is time spent per visitor in seconds. This also gives the average amount of time a dimension is interacted with, but this is calculated at a visitor level. It divides the total seconds spent on a dimension by the number of unique visitors. Then we also have total seconds spent. Instead of dividing the time by visits or visitors or anything else, it simply adds up all of the time that a dimension was interacted with. But just like the others, it needs 2 time points to count the seconds between them, which means any dimensions that are seen on the last hit of a visit will be excluded from the time calculation. There are still 2 other time-based metrics. Unlike the previous one that looks at average time per visit or visitor, the average time and average time in seconds both look at individual hits. So instead of summing up the amount of time spent over multiple hits in a visit or by a visitor, this gives you the average amount of time spent on each individual hit. But again, these need 2 time points to be able to calculate. So let's look at a specific example. Here we have a sample visit from one of our customers. For this example, we want to understand when people look at product A, how much time do they spend on it? So our customer comes to the website, lands on the home page, and then they go to product A at 12:04 and 20 seconds. At 12:05 and 30 seconds, they reload the page. This new hit acts like a barrier and ends the first interaction and starts the second one. So our first hit was 70 seconds long. When the customer moves to product B, that ends the second hit, which was 90 seconds long. Then the customer comes back to product A at 12:07 and 40 seconds, and they stay there until they move to the checkout, giving them a total of 30 seconds for that interaction. They do a few more actions, and then finally they come back to product A, but that's the last hit of their visit. So that fourth interaction with product A doesn't have an endpoint. This means that it won't be used in the calculation since we don't know how long they actually spent on it. So for our average time on site, we're going to take our first 3 interactions and get the average, which is 63 seconds. Whereas if we look at our average time on site in seconds metric, that puts it in a time-based format, so it'll say 1 minute and 3 seconds. Now there is one other thing to keep in mind when using any of these time-based metrics, and that's how you interpret them. If you notice a customer spent 5 minutes on a single page, is it because they read every detail on the page? Or were they looking for something and they couldn't find it, so they were just scrolling around? Or did they leave the page open while they got up and went and made a cup of coffee? It's really hard to tell what they were actually doing, so just be cautious when you're interpreting what these metrics mean. Now, finally, we're going to talk about bot metrics. Bot traffic can be annoying to deal with. Fortunately, Adobe has some default bot detection rules that it runs and filters out this traffic for you. So these bots don't appear in your regular reporting, but they do still count against your hit budget. So it can be useful to know how much traffic they're generating. For this, Adobe has 3 specific metrics that are used to look at the bot traffic that has been filtered out. First, there's bot occurrences. Similar to the other occurrences metric we saw earlier, this includes all types of hits, but those that were filtered out due to the bot rules. Second is the bot page view. Again, this is similar to the other page view metric we saw earlier. It's the sum of all page view calls, but again, only those associated with bot traffic. And finally, we have the bot page view ratio, which gives you a ratio of all the traffic that has been flagged as bots and removed compared to traffic that appears to be legitimate. These bot metrics do have a warning icon beside them, that little triangle with an exclamation mark. If you click on that, it'll tell you that these metrics can only be used with certain dimensions. The first is bot name. This is the name of the bot that Adobe has identified. You can use bot occurrences or page views to see how frequently each bot hits your site. Your second option is to use a time-based dimension like month. This can show you if there have been spikes or drops in the amount of bot traffic over time. Knowing this can help you understand when your site is getting hit with bot traffic the most. Finally, you can use these metrics with the default page dimension. This will show you where on your site bots are targeting. In addition to bot page view or occurrences, you can also use the ratio metric. This gives you an idea of what % of traffic for each type of page is coming from bots. It's likely that there will be a few particular sections on your site that do get hit more frequently than others. In this example, I've also included the regular page view metric so that you can see how the ratio is calculated, comparing the regular page views to the bot page views. So let's recap what we've learned today. Our key traffic metrics are unique visitors, visits, page views, and page events. For visits and visitors, it's important to know that there are certain actions that can end a visit or cause a visitor ID to be reset. So keep those in mind when reporting on your traffic levels. Occurrences include a wide variety of hits such as page views, events, and data sources. And although it's Adobe's default for free-form tables, there are often other metrics that you can use instead that are going to give you much more accurate reporting. Bounces and single-page visits appear similar but can provide very different results. Bounces have a single hit, whereas single-page visits can have multiple hits on one page. Relative metrics like conversion rate can be useful, but make sure that you understand how they're calculated so you can interpret them correctly. For your time-based metrics, remember that the last hit of a visit isn't included in the calculation because there isn't an endpoint for that interaction. And finally, bot metrics can give you insight into traffic that has been excluded from your regular reporting. This can help you to understand what areas of your site are being targeted and how frequently. So I hope that this session has helped you to learn a bit more about the metrics that you see and use every day, that you now know when you should use them, when not to use them, and what to use instead, and that you know how to pick the best metric for each situation to maximize the usefulness of your reporting. So thank you for joining us for this session, and now it's time for some Q&A.